I think a lot of Israelis don't quite understand that if they scream the word fascist, 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 apartheid, 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 it would be very difficult for American Jews to criticize, AOC or whoever for using, if she uses the word apartheid, or Jeremy Corbyn. There is a lack of awareness that they are making themselves less secure.
Hello, I'm Jonathan Tobin, editor-in-chief of the Jewish news syndicate, jns.org, and you're listening to Top Story, a weekly podcast where I analyze the most important stories happening in Jewish news around the world. Each week, I will break down politics, foreign policy, and culture to provide insights into what is going on behind the headlines. Hello, and welcome to Top Story. Thanks for joining us. Today we have an interesting conversation for you about recent events in Israel and around the world with journalist Tom Gross. But before we start, I want to encourage everyone to like this video and podcast, subscribe to JNS, and click on the bell for notifications. Also, we would love to hear from you. Please write to us at editor@jns.org and let us know where you listen or watch the show and what you think about it. I also want to remind you that you don't have to wait a full week for more Top Story analysis. There is a daily Top Story podcast where I share more news and analysis with you about most significant issues we're facing today. You can find the daily show under Top Story with Jonathan Tobin on the JNS channel on Apple, Spotify, Google Play, or wherever you get your podcasts. And now to today's program. For the foreign policy establishment, there's no such thing as admitting that a failed policy was a mistake. As far as the State Department, the intelligence community, and their think tank and media auxiliaries are concerned, the assumptions that have always guided their actions in the past need never be re-examined. For the last 3 decades, their approach to the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians has been based on the idea that Israel should be trading land for peace and that will lead to a two-state solution that will resolve all problems. The fact that the Palestinians are manifestly disinterested in that idea and have never given up on their century-old war on Zionism is a mere detail to be ignored rather than a salient fact to be understood and acted upon. That is the context for the latest American foray into the conflict, in which Secretary of State Antony Blinken effectively drew a moral equivalence between the recent terrorist massacre in Jerusalem that left 7 Jews leaving a synagogue dead and Israel's efforts to capture or kill terrorists. The calls for calm and for both sides to de-escalate is based on the notion that the right response to terror is to reduce efforts to stop the terrorists. That's advice the United States government would never accept about attacks on Americans. That has been followed by American demands for Israel to pause construction of homes in Jewish communities in Judea and Samaria, supposedly an obstacle to the mythical two-state solution, though no one thinks to ask the Palestinians to stop building in their communities. And the head of the CIA is talking about a new Intifada, something that is also part of an effort to pressure Israel, while acquiescing in the fact that the Palestinian Authority continues to incite and subsidize terrorism while largely abandoning its responsibility to keep the peace with Israel. Yet little of this is conveyed in the mainstream corporate media accounts of what is happening in the Middle East, as well as in many liberal Jewish press outlets. At the same time, most of the coverage of Israel lately has been focused on bolstering the anti-Netanyahu resistance movement protests, that taking a page out of the same playbook as the anti-Trump resistance that did so much to hobble his administration. The same outlets that castigate Netanyahu largely give a pass to his detractors as they gaslight and lie about proposals to reform an out-of-control Israeli Supreme Court and misrepresent his opponent's goal of thwarting democracy and overturning election results as actually defending democracy. Many of those smearing Netanyahu and his government as anti-democratic point to the fact that they are oblivious to the fact that they are giving ammunition to pro-Palestinian and anti-Semitic sources that lie about Israel being an apartheid state. And rather than add to our understanding of these events, the media, and not outliers posting on the internet, is the main source of misinformation about Israel and the Middle East conflict. To discuss the situation today, we are pleased to have with us today a veteran journalist who has devoted his career to exposing media bias and advocating for human rights. Tom Gross is a British-born journalist, international affairs commentator, and human rights campaigner, specializing in the Middle East. He was formerly Jerusalem correspondent for the London Telegraph and has been a contributor to the Wall Street Journal, The Guardian, and other papers, as well as a government advisor. Tom Gross, welcome to Top Story.
Hello, hi.
Well, thanks for joining us today, Tom. We really appreciate it. I want to start by asking you about the coverage of the last round of terror attacks and Israel's efforts to deal with Islamic Jihad and other terror groups operating in Judea and Samaria, and the moral equivalence that so much of the international press is drawn between the massacre in Jerusalem and counter-terror operations that resulted in the death of terrorists. We've seen this kind of coverage before, but how is it that the corporate media and even some in the Jewish and Israeli media are still doing it?
Yes, well, I think there are two separate questions. One is, how well is Israel dealing with counter-terrorism operations? And I would say very well, even though there have been terrorism, most notably the attack outside the synagogue about a week ago in which 7 people, 6 Israeli Jewish civilians and 1 Ukrainian who was working in Israel were murdered. Israel has thwarted hundreds, thousands of attacks in the last year or two. So counterterrorism, really, I would give Israel 10 out of 10. I'd also give Israel 10 out of 10 because the number of Palestinian civilians dying in counter-terrorism operations is very, very low. I don't think there's any other army in the world, especially with this kind of guerrilla warfare, that, you know, the operation in Jenin that gave rise to the suicide attack, that was the biggest fatality of Palestinian terrorists. 9 terrorists from Islamic Jihad, Hamas, and a couple from Fatah, and 1 civilian. And we know they're terrorists because Islamic Jihad and Hamas websites call them martyrs and put up their profiles and celebrate, you know, the martyrdom. So obviously it's a terrible thing that 1 Palestinian civilian died. But moving to your next question, the media, notably the New York Times and 1 or 2 other prominent papers, are deliberately obscuring what's going on. So they will say Israel has raided a refugee camp and killed 10 Palestinians. That is not what happened at all. Israel, in a meticulously planned operation to thwart more acts of terrorism that will only target and kill Israeli Jews, has managed to take out and arrest terrorists with an absolute minimum of civilian collateral damage. Of course, all collateral damage is to be regretted, but I can honestly say I'm British, born and brought up in Britain. The British Army, whether in Northern Ireland or Iraq or Afghanistan, like the French Army in Mali, like the Americans in multiple conflicts, have a much worse ratio of combatant to civilian deaths. So Israel is actually doing very well in counter-terrorist operations, but the media, or at least certain elements of the media, are giving a completely different picture of things.
Yeah, that's the point. You know, they are, and I guess, do we put this down, as we often have in the past, to agenda journalism, or is it, you know, as many of us said, it's just mistakes and, you know, editors and reporters who don't know the facts?
Well, it's a bit of both. Let me start with the good news. The good news is, from my point of view, I think, is that Israel the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as a topic has been downgraded in general in the international media in recent years. There are other issues, obviously the Ukraine war, there's climate change, there's economic problems throughout Europe, there is the toxicity of American polarized politics. We now obviously have a presidential election coming up. And then there are other countries that have followed, like China, like Brazil. The other day when Israel had an election on November 1st, I was amazed. Denmark had an election the same day. And I was watching the French news channel. They covered the Danish election more than the Israeli election. And this was Netanyahu's comeback. In years gone by, the European media, anyway, obsessed over Israel. Today, there are very few full-time journalists based in Jerusalem. CNN, for example, moved their Middle East headquarters to Abu Dhabi. A lot of the British newspapers moved their Middle East correspondents to Beirut or Cairo. The only real media outlets that still have a big presence in Jerusalem are the New York Times and the BBC. But most other media, they have less reporting, there's less interest. So that's the good news. The bad news is that the New York Times and BBC are very influential media, and lots of papers just copy what they say. So if the New York Times says Israel raided a refugee camp and killed 10 Palestinians, a lot of journalists will just repeat that because they won't doubt it. So, and of course, this doesn't so much affect Israel, but it has repercussions for Jews and supporters of Israel in the diaspora, in the United States and in Canada and Europe, because if Israel is being portrayed as some kind of murderous country that invades refugee camps and guns people down, then anyone defending Israel or sympathizing with Israel will look like they're supporting some kind of murderous army, when in fact it's not a murderous army. So the real danger of this coverage is not, it doesn't really influence the conflict, but I think it does create a very bad atmosphere for Jews and for supporters of Israel in the United States and elsewhere.
Yeah, I think that's very true. I think it feeds the BDS movement and its efforts to legitimize pro-Israel discourse. It doesn't do much to boycott, Israel's economy, but it does target Jews in universities, throughout the West. I would, sort of push back a little bit in terms of how it affects Israel, is that it also feeds the international campaign in, human rights, the UN Human Rights Council, the United Nations, efforts to make Israel a pariah state, such as the UN Commission of Inquiry about the West Bank, that can, in the long run, do damage to Israel, and which I think most Israelis who've sort of grown up on the idea that the UN is just a talking shop, and there's certainly truth to that, but that the biased media does fuel the efforts of groups like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International and the UN Human Rights Council to smear Israel and to make it harder for it to operate in the world.
Well, that is true, but there's a counter to that, which is that in recent years, Israel has increasingly good relations, not just with the countries we know that it's signed agreements with, which would be Bahrain, United Arab Emirates, Morocco, and Sudan, but many other countries which Israel either already had kind of normalization with, like Turkey. Turkey, which is obviously an important country, it's the second biggest army in NATO, and it's still a regional power. Turkey has moved much closer to Israel. This has got nothing to do with the Palestinian problem. They've moved closer to Israel for completely different reasons, nothing to do with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Just a few days ago, Chad, which is maybe not the country that comes to mind as that important, but it's a very big country in Africa, and it borders important other countries like Libya. So Chad, the Chad president just came to Israel, met Netanyahu. The Chadians, which is mainly a Muslim country, have opened an embassy in Tel Aviv last week, and Israel is about to open an embassy in the capital of Chad. And there are many, many other cases all the time of countries which already had relations, but they're growing closer. India, Greece, Indonesia, that doesn't have relations, the Saudis. It's not official, but all the time there's increasingly cooperation. Some Israeli officials from the government were just invited to a tourism conference that the Saudi government was running in Saudi Arabia. So definitely it's a problem in the West, and definitely it's a problem with the left and the progressive left, both Jewish and otherwise, and human rights industry and UN diplomats. But in the world of economics and intelligence sharing and even tourism, actually Israel's place in the world overall is increasingly growing stronger.
Yeah, I think that's certainly true, and that's the good news, along with some of the bad news that we often have to report. I know the Biden administration hasn't gone down the same rabbit hole as all of its predecessors, in that it hasn't presented a peace plan or tried to initiate negotiations with the Palestinians that they know will fail. But it is still talking about a two-state solution, seeking to pressure Israel about building in the territories, even though houses in existing settlements are really no obstacle to two states if the Palestinians actually wanted such an outcome. What do you make of the effort to preserve the theoretical possibility of a two-state solution, whether this is really helping to foster nonviolence, especially at a time when there's so much talk of moral equivalence between Israel and the Palestinians with respect to terrorism, and not using Secretary of State Antony Blinken's visit to visibly pressure Palestinian Authority leader Mahmoud Abbas about incitement and his pay-to-slay program?
Well, I think they pay lip service to the notion of two states. I think that Tony Blinken, and indeed myself, would support, in theory, two-state solution. If a Palestinian state would live in peace with its neighbors, including Israel, I would welcome a Palestinian state. The question of whether one is imminent or how to get there, I don't think anyone in their right mind thinks it can happen under the present Palestinian leadership of Mahmoud Abbas. Just to remind people, Abbas was voted in a kind of election in 2004 to a 4-year term. It's now 2023. 19 years later. He is 87 or 88 years old. He's not in good health. He's done almost nothing. I think even the most die-hard anti-Israeli people recognize that in Abbas's 19-year leadership, Israel has had 5 different prime ministers. They've had Ariel Sharon, Ehud Olmert, Benjamin Netanyahu, Naftali Bennett, and Yair Lapid. And to one degree or other, all 5 of them have tried to reach out a hand of peace to the Palestinian Authority. So I don't think anyone can really say that it's not the Palestinian Authority that hasn't reached out a hand in peace. It's they who have done almost nothing to enter serious negotiations or show a real willingness to accept Israel and make a compromise. So Abbas will not be around forever. He's not well, and he's 87, 88. Maybe, and it's a big maybe, his successor will turn the page, and maybe that will be the time for the American Secretary of State to consider the possibility of whether peace or some kind of agreement or some kind of statehood in some kind of form is a possibility. But I think Blinken's recent visit, he's doing it because he's doing it. He's doing it so that some of the American media and some progressives in his own Democratic Party will get off his back. I think the recent visit of Blinken, also of National Security Advisor Sullivan, also of the head of the CIA, made a visit the other day to Jerusalem, Burns. I think it's primarily to do with Iran. It's primarily to do with Ukraine. They're kind of coordinating stuff with Israel and Russia and Ukraine and so on. I think the Palestinian issue, he has to go make a courtesy call to Abbas, but I don't think it's the main thing on their agenda. In fact, there's another point as well. They're supposedly concerned about domestic policies in Israel now too. So I'd actually say the Palestinian issue is maybe only 4th, whereas in the past, when Secretary of State Kerry, John Kerry, and before that Condoleezza Rice used to fly here to Israel every other week. I mean, I've never seen someone come so often as John Kerry. He was obsessed with trying to get an Israeli-Palestinian agreement. I think that Tony Blinken, who after all was working for Biden, who was part of that Obama administration, I'm guessing he knows perfectly well not to put too much energy into trying to start up a serious peace plan. And he also probably knows that every time the Americans have tried it, it often sparks violence. It's often counterproductive violence by the Palestinians.
Yeah, I think that part is true. As far as Abbas's possible successor, whoever that is, whenever that happens, of course, I think it's just as likely that he will be, more radical, not less radical, in terms of his attitude towards Israel, given the dynamics of Palestinian politics. But you mentioned the visit of CIA Director Burns, and while he was there, he recently talked about the possibility of another Intifada. Do you think he's right? And does such talk do more harm than good, in that it perhaps encourages Palestinians to do less to stop one, since they believe that puts pressure on Israel?
Well, I hope he's not right. What I'd say is I covered the Second Intifada in detail. I personally saw the aftermath of various suicide attacks. I have a friend who was killed, others injured. I don't think anyone, either Israeli or Palestinian, really wants to relive those years. They were 4 or 5 years of absolute horror for both Israelis and Palestinians. So I don't have the feeling that there's any real itching for violence, not from Palestinians, not from Israelis. Having said that, there are certain terror groups trying to cause terrorism, and that's always been the case. That's been the case for 100 years. I'm not sure that's different. I mean, there've been an uptick in violence in the last year or so, and I don't think it's necessarily to do with domestic Israeli politics. A lot of it is jockeying for position of who will succeed Abbas, because he has no clear successor, and these are different armed groups and armed factions. And sometimes when they hit out at Israel, just like when Hamas launches a couple of rockets, it's actually got nothing to do with Israel. Hamas are sending a signal to Fatah, and there are about 7 or 8 different potential successors in the West Bank to Abbas. So it's very, very complicated, but I don't get the impression that we're about to have another Intifada. And with all due respect to CIA Director Burns, the CIA has got things wrong before in regard to the Middle East.
Indeed, it has.
It certainly has. And also Burns himself was a diplomat and so on. I've heard forever American diplomats and British and French diplomats and New York Times correspondents and BBC correspondents say, oh my God, there's going to be a new Intifada. If you move to Jerusalem, it's going to set the Middle East alight, etc., etc. They're not reading the situation. The second Intifada started mainly because Yasser Arafat wanted it to start. It didn't start by magic, and it didn't start because Ariel Sharon went to the Temple Mount. In fact, as we saw about 3 weeks ago, Itamar Ben-Gvir, who is the new Minister of Public Security and from a far, hard right party, he went in the morning for, I think, 12 minutes for a walk on the Temple Mount, defying Prime Minister Netanyahu's request that he postpone such walk. And people was all getting all excited, and nothing happened. Not a single stone was thrown at him or anybody else. Whereas, I don't know, somebody a politician in Sweden burnt a Quran the other day, and there's mass rioting in Pakistan. We don't read about it that much. In fact, there were demonstrations in the West Bank against Sweden as well. So I think a lot of it is kind of projection of the left, both in Israel and in New York and the United States, of everything's about Israel. It's not everything's about Israel. A lot of the Palestinian stuff is local domestic politics for them, just like a lot of American politics is actually all about America. It's not about the rest of the world. So it's the same with the Palestinians. And in fact, I've always thought, I consider myself a liberal, and in many respects, I am on the left, but I'm very critical of the left, because the left, there's a kind of arrogance and condescension where they don't look at Palestinians as if they've got their own agendas and their own um, tactics and their own battles and so on, for better or worse. Not everything is a response to Israel.
Yeah, I think that's certainly true. And certainly people on the left tend not to give the Palestinians any agency in what they do. But I think that may be important due to some kind of broader intellectual trends. Certainly here in the United States, we know that intersectionality, critical race theory, divides the world up between victims and oppressors, white possessors of white privilege and people of oppressed people of color. And regardless of the facts about Israel or the Palestinians, that's what drives a lot of the apartheid state smears of Israel, because they assume Israel is a white oppressor state, and the Palestinians are the indigenous people of color being pushed around, and that tends to drive coverage, regardless of what's actually happening.
That's very true, unfortunately. And to that extent, I'm not quite sure what Israel can do about it. They can point out that at least 50% of the population are Sephardi or Mizrahi Jews, i.e., their grandparents or great-grandparents come from practically every country in the Middle East and North Africa, and it's nonsense to suggest
they're definitionally people of color. Absolutely, yeah,
exactly. And also, even if Ashkenazi Jews are white, so what? No one can claim that Jews haven't suffered. I mean, not just historically, but even today, there are, as you know better than anyone, because the JNS covers it so well, so thoroughly, there are attacks all the time. I mean, this is what I learn about it often from the JNS. There was a guy with shooting blank shots in the San Francisco Jewish study group. There were attacks. Anyway, there were attacks regularly on Jews, not just the well-known ones where people are actually killed, like in Pittsburgh, Tree of Life. And that's just in America. There are attacks in France and elsewhere. So I defy anyone to say that white Jews, whatever that means, aren't victims too. And I don't think that the Nazis checked whether a Jew was educated or not, or poor or not, before sending him or her to the gas chamber. And I don't think an anti-Semite cares less whether a Jew is white, brown, or black, rich or poor, religious or secular. I mean, we know that the Nazis were happy to murder Jews who were converted to Christianity. Or Jews who had served in the German army in World War I. So anybody who's the slightest bit honest or has any knowledge of history at all will know that Jews are victims. And I mean, I think the whole of intersectionality is nonsense, but at least connected to Jews, it's ridiculous. It's actually a form of anti-Semitism to try and claim that Jews are not victims. Is it, anti-Semitism denial isn't that much better than Holocaust denial?
Yeah, I think that's very true. And of course, if you go back and read what anti-Semites would say about Jews, they didn't consider them white. That was, that's the other thing. Even Ashkenazi, Jews who are Caucasian were not considered white in the same as white Christians. So the whole thing turns the truth and history on its head. You've done a lot of work in the field of human rights reporting. But as we alluded to a little bit before, most of the interest of the international human rights community with respect to the Middle East seems to focus on smears of Israel, about it being an apartheid state, as well as kangaroo court proceedings like the UN Human Rights Council's Commission of Inquiry that seems to take Israel's mere existence as a crime. Those efforts have led to a situation where, a lot of people in the world think that Israelis more or less deserve the atrocities like the Jerusalem massacre because they're the bad guys.
There's no doubt.
But yet Israel doesn't seem to have that much of an effective response to this campaign. Is there a winning strategy that could be implemented in international forums that's going to treat Israel as a pariah state, or is it just something that Israel has to live with?
Well, there are NGOs who are doing their best. So, NGO Monitor is trying to tackle NGOs. UN Watch in Geneva is trying to tackle Yeah, and there are other groups. There is a diaspora ministry in Israel. There is the foreign ministry. They do a bit better than they used to do. Israeli diplomacy could definitely be better overall. Obviously, there are some good diplomats, but overall, they are not as good as they could or should be. Having said that, even with really good diplomats, it's very hard to change, what is basically bigotry. I mean, it is so unfair because it's not just Israel being attacked, it's what people are missing. For example, small thing, there was this massive earthquake yesterday in Turkey and in Syria. I have not heard the word Kurd mentioned once. Most of the victims are Kurds. This is a Kurdish region of Turkey and northern Syria. And you know why a lot of those buildings collapsed? Because I speak to lots of Kurds. I spoke this afternoon to one of my Kurdish friends. She said that the Turkish Erdogan government has what's called an earthquake tax in that region. It taxes people in order to, it's meant to solidify buildings to make them stronger. It spent nothing on that at all. So what I'm trying to say is that yesterday, when the earthquake happened, BBC Radio that I was listening to on the internet immediately said, the tremors were also felt in Gaza. Is everything okay in Gaza? Even though Gaza was very far away from the epicenter and there was no problems in Gaza. But what they don't say is this much bigger group of minority group, the Kurds, 35 million people, they get it again and again. I'd also say this, if there was ever an independent Kurdistan, it's far more likely to be democratic and respect women's rights and so on than an independent Palestinian state would be. And it's far more likely Kurdistan to be an ally of the West. In spite of that, there was almost no interest from the big human rights groups like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, because I'm going to say something a little bit controversial here. There is actually partly a kind of progressive anti-Semitic wing to them, but there's also a very far left Jewish wing who are kind of racked by guilt by the idea that Israel is not absolutely perfect. And people like Ken Roth, who stood down recently as head of Human Rights Watch and now went to Harvard, he's pulling his hair out to criticize Israel because Israel isn't how he wants it to be, which is some kind of fairyland, non-existent, perfect country of which there's never been such a country anywhere on earth ever and never will be. So they have a kind of almost personalized agenda, people like Ken Roth, to push Israel into some kind of utopia. So I think some of the problem is that a lot of the kind of activists are actually themselves anti-Zionist or very left-wing Zionist Jews who are pushing Israel. Same with the New York Times. I think increasingly other groups, I've been to lots of human rights conferences, and other groups I meet from North Korea and Burma, Myanmar, and various African countries, they don't care less about the Palestinians. Most of the Arabs I meet, the Arab human rights activists from Bahrain and Yemen and so on, they're so sick of the West and the media highlighting every little thing that happens in the West Bank and totally ignoring what's happening in Yemen or many other conflicts. You look at the Uyghurs in China, Rohingya Muslims, 800,000 living in terrible conditions. I'll give you a small example that I only discovered last week. Somalia, one of the reasons Somalis in America do not like Ilhan Omar is that her father, a colonel, was part of the previous ruling military regime that carried out a genocide on a minority. I'm afraid I can't remember their name now. 200,000 people died in Somalia. I never even heard of that minority. 200,000 deaths. Or Ethiopia, 500,000 people have been killed in the Ethiopian war in the last 2 years. It's the most deadly conflict on earth. And in America, the media say Black Lives Matter, but apparently they don't matter to liberal media in America. If they did, they would cover the Ethiopian war. It's all phooey.
That's couldn't be a better point. That's exactly right. I think the hypocrisy there is enormous, and it's just ignored completely. I want to turn now to internal Israeli politics. As you've noted, most of the coverage of Israel today has largely been on the protests against Netanyahu's government's plans for judicial reform, rather than on the Palestinian conflict. And a lot of that coverage takes it as a given that the current coalition wants to end democracy. Obviously, they're feeding off of what the Israeli opposition has been saying, which has itself been increasingly, I would say, hysterical and a bit overblown. Do you think this issue is being adequately, reported in the West? And why do you believe that so many Israelis seems to like the judicial system the way it is? And why are they willing to sort of overheat this conflict and turn it into somehow an existential one about democracy? Is it, what is this, what's behind this?
Okay, so I think we have to unpick different things here. On the question of let me just start with the actual question of judicial reform. For about 20 years, the right in Israel, even though they've won most elections, they say that the bastions of power, the media, universities, and the judicial establishment are still in the hands of the liberal left, even though they are the majority and they win elections, a little bit like possibly some other countries, by the way. So, let's take universities, for example, not just in Israel, but in America and Britain. They are complete bastions of the left. They do not represent 50-50, just like most of the media doesn't either. So they say that there needs to be a redressing of the balance to make the Israeli judiciary not become a power in and of itself, and to be more the executive branch to swing things back a little bit. I don't want to comment on all the individual proposals that the new government are proposing for judicial reform. But what I understand from legal friends of mine is that most of them are actually quite good. There is one that is much more contentious, the so-called override clause, and many prominent people who are supporters of Israel, like Alan Dershowitz and others, have criticized this override clause. I believe that in the end, Netanyahu will make a compromise on this, the government make a compromise on this, and we already see President Herzog and in fact Lapid, the opposition leader, Yair Lapid, talking about some kind of compromise. So often Netanyahu says one thing partly to satisfy his own hard right base, and then he'll shift back in. So on the actual process, no, democracy is not going to end. And this is just one reform. Now, let me come to the absolute hysteria of the Israeli left. It is big. I've witnessed hysteria. I was in New York the day that Trump was elected in 2016, and I saw some hysteria among my Democrat supporting friends. I was in London the day Brexit was voted, and I saw some hysteria about that. I have never seen such hysteria as I've seen now. In fact, I just, I'm reading Haaretz in English. If I may, we see it on the internet. I just want to show you a few headlines. I'll read them out. No compromise and no dialogue. War. Okay. This one. Israel's contempt for all children. This one. This fascist government. Blah blah blah. This one. The new dark future for Israeli media. Silencing the media. Israel is enlisting Israel in the fight for a dark world order. Blah blah blah. These are just from the last 3 or 4 days. Okay, this is Haaretz, but it's not only Haaretz. It is crazy. Okay. Israel had a democratic election. It's probably one of the most democratic countries in the world. My criticism is it's too democratic. There are too many political parties. It's too easy to enter the Knesset. The governments don't last enough. There's not enough stability. Israel has had 3 prime ministers, Netanyahu, and then Bennett, and then Lapid, and then again Netanyahu, just in the last less than 2 years. Just last year, we had in the same year, Bennett, Lapid, Netanyahu, right at the end of the year. So the idea that Israel is a democracy is a libel. The idea that gay rights or women's rights are going to be put to an end, as certain New York Times columnists have suggested, is an absolute blood libel against Israel. It's nonsense. The new Speaker of the Knesset, Ohana, is a Likud member appointed close ally of Netanyahu. Netanyahu congratulated him on his gay civil partnership with his husband. They have 2 children, this gay couple. Netanyahu smiled and waved at their kids. This idea that Israel is somehow about to become homophobic is nonsense. Yes, you have 1 or 2 extremist politicians on the far right who are homophobic. But the last government had a party called Ram, a Muslim Brotherhood party, in which some of those members said anti-gay things far worse than the far-right religious ultra-Orthodox Jews, of which I should just say it's only a very handful who said bigoted things. So they are blowing out of all proportion. In terms of the risk of democracy, again, I see it more coming from liberal Jewish commentators. So we have, Tom Friedman on more than one occasion in the New York Times. We had a piece by, I think, 3 different prominent liberal Jewish writers in the Washington Post. We had another joint column in the Times of Israel by Yossi Klein Halevi and Daniel Gordis.
Maddie Friedman, Daniel Gordis, and Yossi Klein Halevi, yes.
We see David Horowitz every day. We see Brett Stevens the other day, who is a strong supporter of Israel. And I have to say, more than half the names I've just mentioned are good friends of mine. I mean, I've been friends with Brett more than 20 years. I've been friends with David Horowitz more than 20 years. We speak, I don't know what to say. I fundamentally disagree with them. And they've slightly lost perspective, let's say here, and I don't know what to say. The Times of Israel, I think, is a good publication. It's a centrist publication, but its reporting on the judicial reforms is hysterical. And I also think it's counterproductive. If you want to oppose the reforms, and just to be clear, on balance, I'm probably unhappy myself with the reforms. You should come up with some alternative, moderated plan which will appeal to a broad section of people and propose it. There's no point in screaming end of democracy. Israel just had a democratic election. No one is suggesting that the votes were rigged. We don't have a kind of Donald Trump situation where he's saying that it wasn't democratic. Everyone accepts this election was democratic. So what does it mean? Even if the judicial reforms do pass, so if they're not good, there'll be an election in 3 years and people will vote Netanyahu out. He's never shown any inclination to not hold elections. On the contrary, he loves elections. He keeps on winning them,
Yeah. I guess my question is, and you've done a great job in laying out the issue and the hysteria. What is this really about? Is it about judges and constitutional principles? Because I don't see much deep thinking from the sort of anti-Bibi resistance about that issue. Yeah. Or is it about who gets to run the country regardless of who wins elections?
Yeah, I think there are 2 things. One is what you've just said. They haven't won the election. So, I mean, I'm going to say something a bit controversial here, but many people, and I'm somewhat sympathetic with them, believe the entire corruption charges that were brought against Netanyahu 2 or 3 years back was also a kind of attempt to hound him out of office. They thought he'd step down. If they threatened charges, he'd step down. So they kept on threatening them, which is why at least 50% of Israelis think these charges are nonsense, and they're the kind of things that would never be brought in fact, I can say from Britain that Boris Johnson, the last Prime Minister, he did do exactly what Netanyahu is accused of doing, much worse, and no one's going to put him on trial or whatever for corruption. So, and I'm pretty sure that the Bidens and the Trumps and the Clintons have probably done some slightly more dubious thing than Netanyahu's ever done. No one's accusing Netanyahu.
You can count on that, yeah.
Yeah, well, I'm being British understatement. I'm trying to say that no one's saying that Netanyahu's got a suitcases of cash under the bed or in the Cayman Islands or whatever. So it's this ongoing harassment to beat him. This ongoing harassment, including now, is because they're very, very angry that they haven't won the election. And it's a little bit like after the 2016 election, where Trump beat Hillary Clinton, there was rage. They're like, how dare you? How dare you beat our candidate? It's so obvious that our candidate ought to be the president, i.e. Hillary. And they just didn't want to admit that Trump won for whatever reason. He won because he conducted a better campaign in the Midwest or whatever, or he connected to voters somehow. He did not win because Vladimir Putin rigged the electoral process, but they just couldn't accept that he won. So they had to go after all these theories, this one and that one. So we see also in Israel something similar. And what I say to my friends here in Tel Aviv is I want Israel to have a strong centre-left party, a kind of social democratic party. So the obvious thing is 6 of these opposition parties, stretching probably from Gideon Saar, Gantz, Lapid, Lieberman, the Labour Party and Meretz, should be one party. That party has less differences than there are within the American Democratic Party or the British Labour Party or the British Conservative Party or any other, the Social Democrats in Germany. It should be one party. They should have one leader. They should have a manifesto of the kind we have in Britain, where they outline policies like transport. Anyone who's been to Israel recently knows there are endless traffic jams and all kinds of congestion. Israel needs a proper transport policy. It needs a better education policy. So they should first come together, unite as a party, stop screaming hysteria, put an attractive, good candidate, and then make themselves electable. Because even if they push Netanyahu out of office, you know what? They won't win the next election. The right's going to win it again because the left are so divided. So one of the reasons, as you mentioned, is they're just bitter and angry that they can't get their own house in order to put on a proper party to beat Netanyahu. That's one thing. Another thing is they probably kind of regret that Israel doesn't have term limits. And I too think Israel should have term limits. I think after the present, Netanyahu's retired, we shouldn't have a situation again where anybody can be empowered for too long. However good they are, I don't think it's a good idea, whether it's 8 years, 10 years, whatever. Israel should have term limits, a bit like the United States does. Otherwise, we'd have Bill Clinton probably standing again and Barack Obama at the next election. So we should have term limits. But just to finish off on your question, there is one other reason that I think people are angst in Israel. Very belatedly, they realize there is this demographic ticking time bomb or problem where the ultra-Orthodox have far more children, and the settler movement also have more children, and Israeli Arabs also have more children than the Ashkenazi elites or the bread and butter that serve in the army and push the economy forward and high tech and dominate the arts and so on. And there is a worry that Israel will become either more religious or perhaps more Middle Eastern. And there is this fear, I would say, and that's what's really underlying them. But, again, it's not Netanyahu's fault that there are these demographic or other trends. And if they want to stop it, what they should do, even now, is go to Netanyahu and say, I'm talking about Lapid and Gantz, they have enough Knesset members. They should say, listen, we will join your government if you break up with the far-right and religious parties. We will support you. We'll even do some kind of, watered-down judicial reform. And in turn, we will have productive measures to integrate the ultra-Orthodox population into the economy. Not just push them into the army, but go to the ultra-Orthodox and say, listen, it's better for you if you're more skilled and have more work quality, more work possibilities. We will integrate maths and other more secular subjects from the beginning, age 3, 4, 5, into the education system. We will allow you to have kosher-friendly workplaces and so on. They've got to come with a positive, proactive approach, not an approach of rage and hysteria that convinces no one and makes it hard to listen. And, I love David Horowitz and Bret Stephens. I mean, I really do. They're wonderful people and wonderful writers. But I'm like, guys, keep a lid on things. Let's not, drink the Kool-Aid or whatever.
Yeah, well, that's certainly true. Do you worry at all, about one aspect of this, and that the rhetoric of the sort of anti-Bibi resistance, as I've been calling it, in some ways, I don't know how much of an impact it's having on the pro-Israel community in the United States, for one, but it does sort of their rhetoric does seem to echo a lot of this, and provide ammunition to the anti-Israel community in the United States, which continues to doubt that Israel is a democracy, claim it's an apartheid state. I obviously that's not what the protesters want, or certainly what Brett Stevens or David Horowitz want. But they do seem a bit oblivious to the damage that overheated rhetoric might do to their country's reputation, and perhaps even if its economy, if they really scare people into leaving, in the high tech sector.
Well, it's very dangerous. I mean, they can literally cause the shekel fell allegedly because of the nerves around this, the Israeli currency. Well, there are people who don't understand the rest of the world, and this is an entirely domestic Israeli thing. A lot of the protesters, it's really about a kind of culture war within Israel, a bit like the United States and Britain and Brazil and various other countries have this very, very divided, regrettably divided culture war, where I consider myself somewhere in the middle ground, and it's very, very difficult to open my mouth on all kinds of subjects because I'm getting it on both sides. So I think a lot of Israelis don't quite understand that if they scream the word fascist, 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 apartheid, 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 it will be very difficult for American Jews to criticize, AOC or whoever for if she uses the word apartheid, or Jeremy Corbyn or something. Jeremy Corbyn will say, well, I'm just quoting what 100,000 demonstrators were shouting in Tel Aviv. So I think there is a lack of awareness that they're making themselves less secure. They are playing into this. As far as someone like David Horowitz, Brett Stevens, Yossi Klein Halevi, of course they are aware of their words. And I can only guess that they've made an assessment that Netanyahu is some kind of clear and present danger, and they need to shout from the rooftops to somehow bring him down. But my question would be, even if he fell, what's the alternative? I mean, start planning for the next election. The opposition, create an attractive alternative party. Otherwise, even if Netanyahu does retire from politics, the idea that the Likud won't choose another person who has similar views, who's, in fact, Netanyahu's on the left of the Likud. He's quite liberal on social issues and so on. In American terms, he'd probably be a Democrat on most social issues, even progressive on gay rights and women and so on. He's not they're just as likely to get a new Likud leader who will be more to the right of Netanyahu. So this isn't about Netanyahu. I think there's some similarities in the United States or Britain in the sense that there's a lot of attacks on Donald Trump, and of course I understand why there's criticism of Donald Trump, but Trump also taps in to genuine resentment across a large swathe of the American working classes. And I think that, maybe Joe Biden, because he had this sort of reputation of, being kind of in touch in the past, at least supposedly with white working class America, was acceptable candidate. But I think in general, there is a wider problem, a cultural problem there in Israel, like there is in America and quite a lot of other countries.
Yeah. I think that's very true. Let's turn in the remaining time we have left to discuss the war in Ukraine. For the last year, there has been a campaign on the part of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky to pressure Israel into joining the conflict. Both the current government and its predecessor tried to thread the needle on Ukraine by publicly opposing the Russian invasion while not trying not to be drawn into the conflict, for very obvious reasons that it doesn't want trouble with a Russian power based in Syria. And, Moscow still effectively holds Russian Jews hostage. Do you think Zelensky's efforts have persuaded many Israelis in the way they seem to have won over so many Americans to think that Israel should get more involved in the war?
No. I think, well, there are several things. First of all, Zelensky personally diaspora Jews make a big deal that Zelensky is of Jewish origin. So, for example, the London Jewish Chronicle has put him on the cover a number of times saying Jew of the Year. Okay, Bret Stephens the other day said
you mentioned Bret Stephens,
Sorry.
Comparing him a better Jewish leader than Netanyahu. Crazy.
But I don't want to just mention Bret. But anyway, the point is that I think people in Israel know that just because Zelensky is of Jewish origin does not necessarily mean he has Jewish interests at the forefront of his agenda. And in fact, the only other Jewish leader of a European state I can think of in the post-war era was Kreisky in Austria in the late 1970s, early 80s, Bruno Kreisky. And he was so anti-Israel, he welcomed Yasser Arafat. He was actually accused of being an anti-Semite. And so Kreisky was elected in Austria. That didn't mean that the Austrians suddenly loved Jews. In fact, after Kreisky, they elected Kurt Waldheim, the former Nazi war criminal, knowing that he was a Nazi because he'd already been expelled from the UN in America. So just because Ukrainians voted Zelensky does not mean Ukraine has suddenly become, they haven't voted Zelensky because he's Jewish. It's got nothing to do with that. And Zelensky is a product of the Soviet Union. So when he came and addressed the Knesset and essentially engaged in kind of soft Holocaust distortion or denial and greatly angered people in Israel, I mean, I don't think he's doing it on purpose. I think he's just very, very ignorant, as are a lot of people who grew up in the Soviet Union. He doesn't know about the Holocaust. I mean, for example, my grandfather was born in a town called Korokhov, which was in Poland, now in Ukraine. He left already age 14 for Britain. But in Korokhov, 5,500 Jews there were all murdered in 2 days, okay, mainly by Ukrainians, by Ukrainian division of the SS. 5,500, they've changed the name, there's no memorial there, no one's ever heard of Korokhov apart from me. What I want to say is in this horrible war, which we hope ends, and of course Putin's to blame, and of course we should want Ukraine to win, but this isn't the worst war in the world. I've just mentioned the war in Ethiopia. The actual number of civilian deaths, according to the UN, is something like 8,000 or 9,000. It's terrible, but it could be much worse. So I also think Israel doesn't want it's telling America and others, don't turn this into some massive war. Let's calm things down. Prime Minister Bennett tried to bring peace negotiations, and he gave an interview yesterday in which he said the Western governments put a stop to them, even though he had an understanding between Putin and Zelensky. So I think that it is not, this war is not as nearly as bad as it could yet become. And I'm very wary about this rush to just pour more and more weapons in. When Israel and Hamas have a little flare up, there's immediately calls for ceasefire. The whole world calls for ceasefire. Where are the calls for a ceasefire? Do we want more Ukrainians and Russians to die? I don't. I think Ukraine has shown a valiant, fight, and now they should try and find some compromise to maybe leave areas which are really full of Russian speakers and ethnic Russians in Crimea or possibly in Donetsk or Luhansk, way to the east, where the population is more Russian than Ukrainian. If they want to be part of Russia or be part of some independent province within Ukraine, I can't give you the ceasefire. But I don't think it's a good idea for the rest of the world to encourage a huge war. And I'd say, Ariel Sharon went to Bush before the Iraq war. And in fact, I said it also before the Afghan war. Be careful what you're doing here. Where's it going to end? And 20 years later, what did everyone get out of Afghanistan? So many deaths on all sides, so much money. Where's it all going to end? I think a ceasefire now wouldn't look very different than a ceasefire in 5 years from now. Only they're going to be 500,000 dead, and it's going to be impossible to reconstruct Ukraine, and not enough money to do it. I mean, I feel sorry for the Ukrainians, but I don't think the Israeli position is the wrong one. I think Ukraine might want to listen to some wisdom. Israeli leaders understand the cost of war, which is why, in spite of Netanyahu being called a warmonger, actually is the opposite. He hasn't had any major wars, and they're very, very cautious to get dragged into Syria or whatever.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I've been writing some of the same things. Right now, the focus, the obsessive focus of American foreign policy is, doubling down on the war in Ukraine and not trying to solve it or end it. And also, we don't really hear much about the efforts by, the Ukrainian government to basically shake down Israel, both in terms of trying to sell their votes in the UN for arms or granting visits to the foreign minister in exchange for money and arms. That's a story that seems to go nowhere.
But not just that, Israel has been very generous. Israel set up field hospitals. It's treated thousands of injured Ukrainians. It's flown at Israeli cost Ukrainian wounded soldiers and treated them in Israeli hospitals. It's giving them bulletproof ambulances, which are the very state of the art. It's giving them intelligence warnings. It's bombed drones in Iran. Well, it hasn't admitted it, but I think we know that Israel has bombed drones in Iran. Those drones would have also been used by Russia, who would have bought them from the Iranians on the Ukrainians. Israel is giving intelligence. But in the end, also someone has to be a mediator. So it's not just Israel. Most of the rest of the world is not supporting Ukraine. This war is being driven by America and Britain and maybe Poland and the Baltics. The Germans and French are sort of going along. They're lukewarm, also the Italians and Spanish. And I'm like, where's it all going to end? Let's suppose you get rid of Putin. Then what? You think you're going to get democracy in Russia? You're going to get someone worse than Putin, or even worse, there's going to be anarchy. Russia's going to break up. 6,000 nuclear weapons, the world's biggest arsenal, are going to go all over the place. There are going to be lots of independence movements from, Dagestan and Chechnya and whatever. Be careful what you wish for. Again, I'm all for having a democratic Russia. I wish for it. It will be amazing, like a democratic Palestine, like a democratic Iran. But you can't just break something. Look, the West broke Libya. Okay, Britain, France, and America helped break Libya. And until today, we have chaos. We have war in Libya, and it has repercussions for the West because there is no border control, and millions of people from Africa are attempting to reach Europe, and they are destabilizing Europe. And you have a right-wing counter-reaction. You have kind of neo-fascistic governments voted now in Italy and in Sweden. You also have Libyan arms going to Sinai, to ISIS there. You have them going south into Mali, to Islamic groups in Somalia, Nigeria, and so on. So the West broke Libya, and until today, we can't put it back together. And I was a kind of supporter up to a point of the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, but I'm like, Iraq, you can't put it back together. I mean, I'm not saying we shouldn't have got rid of Saddam. Great to get rid of Saddam. Great to get rid of Putin, but you have to do these things with very clear goals of what's going to happen afterwards. Where, the idea that you can't be worse is wrong. You could be worse than Putin.
Yeah, I think that's very true. There seems to be a genuine reluctance to learn from history in this case, as in so many others. Tom, you've given us some tremendous insights on these issues. Thanks so much for coming on, a great conversation. And we also want to thank our audience. Please remember to tune in every day for Top Story Daily Edition, whether you're listening to us on Spotify or any of the other podcast platforms, or watching us live on Facebook or Twitter, or on the JNS YouTube channel, or on JBS TV. Please like and or subscribe to Top Story, click on the bell for notifications, and give us good reviews. Please write to us at editor@jns.org and let us know where you listen or watch the show and what you think about it. And remember, keep reading and thinking for yourself, and we'll see you again next week.